Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor to be here again, presenting to you guys. Uh, Let me share my screen. Sorry, it's still early here. So let's talk about how we can choose Azure services for working with events and for monitoring apps. So if you don't know me, my name is Barry. I'm from the Netherlands. So that's why I have such a weird last name, Barry Luijbrechts. I'm a software developer and architect with a passion for the cloud. And I create also courses for Pluralsight and now also for my own website, which is azurebarry.com. Soon there you will see a free course for Microsoft Azure for absolute beginners. Now, I know most of you are not absolute beginners. It'll be free. It will also be on YouTube. So if you have any friends that are interested in Microsoft, you can point them towards there. Just connect with me on LinkedIn or something and you'll see it flash by. And then another passion project that I'll be doing, that I am doing already, is improvingbarry.com. See, it's similar logos there. And that's where I talk to experts about health and wellness, where I learn about health and wellness from experts, from doctors and such. And I do that in the form of a podcast, which is weekly, which you can find there, improvingbarry.com. Also articles, and later on there will also be courses. But for now, on to what we are here to learn, right? Which is how to choose Azure services for working with messages in your application. We'll start with that. And once this topic is done, we'll start with the monitoring part. So messages in your application. Now, why are we even talking about this? Well, that's because Azure has many, many options for doing anything really in Azure, right? So for messages, you have Azure Storage Queues, which is a queue where you put a message, which is a small piece of data, and then another application can take that piece of data and do something with it. So that's great to offload work, let's say. You also have Azure Service Bus queues and topics, so also a queue and then also a topic. The difference between a queue and a topic in this case is that a queue is a message where one application takes that message and processes it, where a topic can, multiple applications can take the message and do something with it based on what kind of topic they subscribe to. So messages from the shopping cart or messages from a user action, for instance. So storage queues, Azure Service Bus queues and topics. There's also Azure Web Pub Sub. This is relatively new and is for publish subscribe. So you use this for a real-time application where you have a client like a website, for instance, and a server that does something. So this could be a website from a Bitcoin site, for instance, where you see the actual price of Bitcoin, and then that will be updated in real time because then that is subscribed to whatever publishes that that price. So for real-time action, you can use Azure Web Pub Sub. There's also Azure Notification Hubs, which you use to send messages to mobile devices. So for instance, your iPhone or your Android phone. You send that message to Azure Notification Hubs. Okay. And then there's Azure Event Grid, which is a great thing. You can use that to send events from things in Azure or from other things to your own server or service. So for instance, you can create an event when a blob is uploaded to Azure Blob Storage, and then fire that event and then catch it, for instance, with an Azure function and then do something. Or in your own service somewhere else with a webhook and do something. That's really a great service. There's also Azure Event Hubs, and that's meant for ingesting massive amounts of data, like for instance, what could that be? Streams of data that you get in there, and then it can filter that data, it buffers the data, and then applications can come in later and then process that data. And a similar service to that is Azure IoT Hub, which you can also use to ingest massive amounts of data. But this is meant specifically for IoT as it is bidirectional. So it can also send messages back to the IoT devices to, for instance, restart them. And then there's also Azure Signal R service, which is very similar to Azure Web Pub Sub in that it is meant for real-time applications. So you can have a client, for instance, that can display the price of Bitcoin, and then a server somewhere else that sends the updated price in real time to that client, and then you see it change in real time. There is a difference between the two, and I'll explain that in a later slide. And then there is Azure Functions and Azure Logic Apps. And these seem a bit strange in a slide about working with messages in Azure, but they are triggered by messages in Azure. So for instance, again, when a blob is uploaded, that could be a trigger for an Azure function to fire or a trigger for Azure Logic Apps to fire. And also they have bindings, so they can send messages to those same services. So you can have Azure Functions do something and then write out a message or a new blob, for instance, or a new message to a queue without doing any plumbing, just by configuring the bindings in Azure Functions or in Azure Logic Apps. So these are the options for working with messages in Azure. Now, how do you choose from them, right? That's the point here. And by the way, if you have any questions, you can write them down. I'm not looking at them right now, but we will go through them at the end, okay? So let's first define what a message is, right? So a message, like I said, is a small piece of data that you can do something with, and you can divide them in different categories. So a message can be a message of intent, which is usually a command of something that you want to happen. So you send something somewhere that you want to happen, which could be you want to increase the temperature in your home. So you send a message to your smart thermometer to increase the temperature of your home, right? And you could get a message back from that device that says, all right, I got it. It's fine. I'm working on it. So a message of intent. Now, storage queues and service bus queues and topics can definitely handle that. They can put that message on their queue and send that, and another application can then get that. Also, SignalR, Service and Web PubSub work perfectly for that as well. And also Azure IoT Hub and Logic Apps and Azure Functions can also work in this scenario. Now, another category of message is facts. So we can have messages of intents, something that we want to do, and a message of facts. And a message of facts you can also divide into something that is discrete data, which is then something that happens once or occasionally, like a door that opens or closes. So the door status changed event, let's say, which is a fact, right? The door is now open or it is closed. And we can use Azure Event Grid for messages like these, and also SignalR again and Web PubSub. But also Azure Notification Hubs works perfectly for such a thing. And besides discrete facts, discrete data facts, we also have streams of data, right? Like we talked about already. This can be a continuous stream of data, like for instance, temperature data that comes from a thermostat somewhere in your house. And that data is related to each other. So for instance, every second, there is a piece of data that says, all right, it's now 25 degrees Celsius, 25 degrees Celsius, 25 degrees Celsius. And then it's up to the service to filter out the value of the information. So when the temperature changes, for instance. Services that can help with this is Azure Event Hubs. Like I said, it can take in all of this data and then, for instance, query it or filter it so that you know when it changes and then do something with it, route it to another service. And also Azure IoT Hubs. So it's kind of the same like Event Hubs, but then it's bidirectional, where it can also send messages back to the other side, so the device that is actually sending things, the IoT device. So that's messages, intents and facts. Now, storage queues and service bus queues and topics are extremely similar, right? That sounds very similar. So let's see what the difference there is. And we'll take a look at Azure Service Bus Queues and Azure Storage Queues here. So Service Bus Queues, messages in the Service Bus, can live longer than 7 days. They have a guaranteed order, so first in, first out. You can configure that. They also have things like duplicate detection and a dead letter queue as well. And their message size can be 1 megabyte or smaller. So they're pretty fancy. And the same goes for Azure Service Bus topics as well. Azure Storage Queues they have a message lifetime that is less or equal to 7 days. So smaller than that. They can have a huge queue size, which is due to, it's Azure storage. So you can just store lots and lots of data on there. They have things like transaction logs, but, Service Bus queues also has that. And they have a much smaller message size. So that's 64 kilobytes or smaller. Now, if you ask me, the big difference between these two is that Azure Service Bus queues is much fancier than Azure Storage Bus queues. So if you look in the Azure portal, for instance, let's see, this here is a service bus, so an Azure Service Bus. It's called an Azure Service Bus namespace, and it has queues and it has topics. So if you look at this queue here, we have, it already looks a bit fancy, right? So you can have a max delivery count. You can have a message logs, auto delete, time to live, things like that. It's really pretty fancy. And that means it's also, it has duplicate detection, see, and all these things. And that also means that it is, of course, more expensive than Azure Service Bus queues, which is logical, right? Now, let's compare these services first. So we have Service Bus queues, Service Bus topics, Event Grid, Event Hubs, IoT Hub, Notification Hubs, Azure Logic Apps and Azure Functions. I put those together, and Azure Signal R Service and Azure Web PubSub, which I also put together simply because there's no more space on the slide. Yeah. So if you want to send a message to make something happen, so a message of intent, right? You can use Service Bus queues, Service Bus topics, which kind of do the same, but then based on a subscription. Also IoT Hub you can use for that, Logic Apps and Functions, and Signal R and Web PubSub like we discussed. If you want to subscribe to and publish discrete events, Azure Event Grid is very good at that. And also Notification Hubs works for that. And also Signal R and Web PubSub work very well for that. If you want to analyze contextual data in bulk, so for instance, the temperature data that we just talked about, then Event Hubs is very good for that. If you want to send a message to just one subscriber, then Service Bus Queues works for that. You put a message on the queue, and then one application takes it off of there. If you want to send a message to multiple subscribers, you can use Azure Service Bus topics. But also kind of all of the other ones, because if you put something on an event hub, for instance, then multiple applications can take that off of there as well. If you want to orchestrate a message-driven workflow, so something that is triggered by a message, you could use Azure Logic Apps, and also Azure Functions. And if you want to receive and also send messages to IoT devices, then of course Azure IoT Hub is great for that. And finally, if you want to send notifications to many devices over different protocols, then you can use notification hubs there as well. As like I said, I don't know if that came across because someone was unmuted there, but notification hubs you can use to send a message to it, and then it can send messages to mobile notification providers, like for instance for Apple or for Android. So you don't have to write the plumbing to actually send messages to Apple or Android. Notification Hubs does that for you. You just send your messages to Azure Notification Hubs. Now, like I said, these two are very similar, right? Azure Signal R Service and Azure Web PubSub. So what's the difference? Well, Azure Signal R Service is really not really Web PubSub or publish subscribe. It's different. It's a proxy for client server communication. So you really have an Azure Signal R service server that you need to have, and that can be a managed thing in Azure, or you can host that yourself as well. And then you can have multiple clients that subscribe to that service. Where Azure Web PubSub is much more simple. So it's really just a publish subscribe mechanism. Azure Signal R service runs on multiple protocols, so RCP as well, streaming as well. WebSockets works as well, where Azure Web PubSub is, again, much more simple. It only supports WebSockets. And Azure SignalR service has more advanced features, like when a client loses connection to the server, it does connection recovery by repolling, and it does some caching as well. Where in Azure Web PubSub, that's very, very limited. It does some retries, but that's kind of it. That's because of that, you can also have presence within Azure SignalR service. So you can, for instance, show when a client is online, yes or no, which can work in a situation like this. For instance, you could build a Microsoft Teams application. And that doesn't exist in Azure Web PubSub. It's much more simple, where Azure SignalR service is much more complex, so for more complex situations. Web PubSub is for more simple situations. And again, the price is also reflects that as well. So Azure SignalR service is more pricey than Azure Web PubSub, logically. All right, so that was messages in Azure. Now move on to how to choose Azure services for monitoring your application. Again, there are many options for monitoring applications in Azure. We have Azure Application Insights. This is definitely my favorite. So use that to monitor single applications, desktop or web applications. There's a Visual Studio App Center. I put that in here because this also has a function within the cloud ecosystem of Microsoft. And you use this to monitor mobile applications that you also publish from Visual Studio App Center. There's Azure Network Watcher, which is a specialized function of Azure Monitor that you use to sniff packages and to watch network traffic. There's Azure Monitor itself, which is an overarching thing of which Application Insights is actually a feature, and also Network Watcher is a feature of Azure Monitor. And you use that to monitor your complete subscription. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a second. There's Azure Security Center, which everybody can use for free. There's a free tier and also a standard tier, and I think even a pro tier now as well. You can use that to see how your security stature is within your Azure subscriptions, and then act on that by preventing things and implementing best practices around security. There's Azure Advisor, which hooks into that by showing you actionable recommendations around performance, excellence, operations, pricing, and also about security. So it will tell you, hey, you're exposing a port here on this VM. Is that a good idea? Maybe you want to change that. And then there's also Azure Sentinel, which is also security focused, but then a bit more broad than Security Center. And again, so some of these things overlap, and I will explain more later. So these are just some of the services in Azure that you can use for monitoring. There are more services as well, but I don't want to overcomplicate it. For instance, for security now, there's also Microsoft Cloud Defender, and that's more broad for not only Azure, but also your Office 365 and Dynamics, for instance. So we'll focus on these for now. Now, the first thing that I want to do when I try to decide between these services is ask myself the question, well, what is the scope that I need to monitor? Is that a single application or is that broader? And then I can take a look at the functionality that I actually need from that service, and then I can make my choice. So the first one, what kind of scope do I need? Well, is that application level, which is Azure Application Insights, right? That monitors a single application, a web or desktop application, or App Center, a mobile application? Or is that broader? So for instance, subscription level or resource group level or management group level or multiple subscriptions, or even look outside into AWS, which some services also do. So that's the first divide that I make there. And then let's take a look at Azure Application Insights. You probably have heard of this, I hope. It's really cool. So you use it to monitor web and desktop applications in detail. You can monitor and alert on many things like availability, performance, failures, usage, much more. If you have instrumented your application with the Azure Application Insights SDK as well, you can see a lot within, for instance, failures, where you can actually drill down into the exceptions and sometimes even get some debug information that you can use locally to debug your application with the snapshot debugger. You can also configure ping and multi-step tests to make sure that your application is available and up and running. And this thing sends data to a log analytics workspace. So like I said, this thing is part of Azure Monitor, and Azure Monitor uses log analytics workspaces, which are basically buckets of data. I'll explain what that is in a second. So that's what it used to send its data to. It can also continuously export raw data so that you can take that and use that within your own application or own organization to analyze. And it does that in JSON format, and it also has a cool application map. And I'll show you what that is, because I like that a lot. Do I have it? This is an Application Insights, an Azure Application Insights instance. And there's many features like you see here in the menu, including the application map. This is a very simple application. Oh, you're lying. You just showed it to me. So let's see. Come on. Let's see if you can show it to me. You must. Always the demo gods, right? The most simple demo, just show a service and it doesn't even work. All right, maybe, oh, wait. This might be it. Let's just do this. Need some data, of course. Right. So the application map can show you all the things that are connected to your application and then also the calls and failures to it. So if you look here, oh, this is actually my client. So my app service, or the thing that this actually runs on. I can see how many views there were. I can see the performance as well, and also where it called to. So for instance, it called to an API here to app.fusebox.fm, and you can then see how long that actually took. And that's a long time, actually. That's a very slow service. I should definitely look into that. Oh, let's see if I can move towards there. Just did it. And here it makes calls to another HTTP service as well. Let's see if we can do that. Yeah. So to these other things as well, which also takes a long time. Gee, I really need to take a look at this. So you can use this to get an overview of all of the services that are connected to your application, including, for instance, SQL databases, things like that. And then see how fast or slow things are and where failures happen as well. So apart from that, of course, you can see things like usage events. So how your thing is used. See if we have some data actually for this website. Yeah. And of course, more data about where your users are coming from and all the things that also Google Analytics and things like that also do. So I can see here, for instance, where my users are, United States, Spain, a couple, United Kingdom, which operating systems they have, which browser versions, and what actually happened, right? So which pages they actually went to. So that's Application Insights. You can use that basically with any type of application. Doesn't really have to be .NET. And it just kind of really works. Very cool. So let's talk about that Azure Monitor, right? Which we talked about that. That's that overarching thing that you can use to monitor subscriptions and broader things like that. Excuse me. So there are many things in Azure and also outside of Azure that generate monitoring and logging data, right? There's Azure Resources, there's applications, your own application. So Azure Resources are things like an app service or an Azure SQL database or whatever service you have running there. There's agents that run on your Azure VMs, for instance, or on your VMs that you have running in your own data center. They create logging and monitoring data. And there's also data collector APIs that also run in Azure and also produce data. Now, where do we put all of that data, right? So that kind of monitoring logs, we put that in logs log analytic workspace, like we just saw. So for instance, Application Insights sends all of its logs to a log analytics workspace. And that's nothing else than just a specialized database that we can use to monitor, yes, just exactly this. And then there's also an Azure Monitor Metrics data store. And that is a time series based data store that you can use to put all of your metrics in. So your CPU time, your HTTP queue time, HTTP queue length time, things like that, that for instance, your VM produces, your memory time. And these two you can then use within Azure Monitor. So in Azure Monitor Log Analytics, for instance, which is a feature of Azure Monitor, you can see all of the Azure Monitor logs and dissect them and make reports from them and query them as well. And with the Metrics Explorer, you can see all of the things that are in Azure Monitor Metrics data store and explore them there. You can use that with shared tools like dashboards, workbooks, insights, alerts, and also specialized queries in there as well. And let's see, I think I had something open here. I didn't. Well, so if we look here in metrics, this hooks into, see, that metric-based store, right? So let's see what we can see, if there's anything we can see. Don't think I have any of that. So like this, like page views, for instance. And then here in the logging, sure, let's do that. This is, here we are querying that log analytics workspace. So that bucket of data basically, with all sorts of pre-made queries, and I can make my own queries as well. Let's see, nothing comes out of here. What am I actually querying? This one maybe, yeah. And then it can make charts from it. All sorts of beautiful graphics. Just the results. Can I see just the results? No. Yeah, it can. It's just extremely slow on my computer. Maybe I should get a new computer. Everything is very slow today. So that is how Azure Monitor works. Really useful. And that's basically your entry point into monitoring, right? So if you want to monitor anything within Azure, you need to go to Azure Monitor, basically. So then there was also Azure Security Center versus Azure Sentinel, right? So Security Center, we can use that to get some actionable information about our security posture. And Azure Sentinel, I said, was a bit broader. So what's the difference there? Well, if you have your security process within your organization, there are several steps. So there's collect and prevent, which visibility of how is your security doing, and then prevention as well. So, hey, you have a port open here, maybe you should close that. There is detect, so analytics and hunting as well for when actually something happens. So, hey, there's somebody that's trying to do a denial of service attacks, and then maybe somebody got in. Now we need to hunt them down, try and find where they went and what they actually did and what the impact was. And then we can investigate those incidents of what happened, and then we can respond to them, perhaps with automation, like scripts that we write to harden things, to turn off services, shut down VMs, you name it. So within this whole process, Azure Security Center is very good at the first bits there. So in getting visible how your security stature is. So how are you doing? Which things should you work on? And how can we work on our prevention, right? And Azure Sentinel does that as well. Not as well as Security Center, but it also does the rest of the things. So hunting, incidents, automation, all that stuff. It's very good at. So together, so I would always use them together, where Security Center is really the best at visibility and prevention, although Sentinel also does that as well. But Sentinel is much broader, where it does all of these things, including the visibility and prevention. So that's kind of the difference there. Now let's compare these services, right? So we have Apps Insights, Visual Studio App Center, Network Watcher, Azure Monitor, Security Center, Azure Advisor, and Azure Sentinel. Now, if we want to monitor a web or a desktop application, then we use Application Insights. And if we want to monitor a mobile application, then you can use Visual Studio App Center, right? You use that to monitor mobile applications, also to deploy mobile applications. If you want to investigate and respond to security issues, like we just discussed, you can use Azure Sentinel for that. If you want to inspect network traffic to diagnose, you can use Azure Network Watcher for that, which is really like a network sniffer, right? If you want to get an overview of all the monitoring data, like we just saw, you can use Azure Monitor, which really is your go-to place for monitoring anything within Azure. And if you want to monitor and prevent security issues, you can use Security Center. And then if you want to get an overview of actionable recommendations, you can use Azure Advisor, which, by the way, is free for everybody. And if you have never been there, after this, go to the Azure portal, open Azure Advisor, see what it says, and implement some stuff that it says, because maybe you can save some money, for instance. All right, that's already it. It's fast, so we have some time for some questions here. Again, you can go to azurebarry.com. There will be some courses coming out there soon. Also, improvingbarry.com. That's a free podcast and articles there as well.